if you're unable to fill your cup, it's very hard to pour, right? So you can't run on empty. And so the biggest thing that I always, even moms and family and friends that have just had children, new moms, even moms with kids in their teens, make sure you carve out time to make sure that you're providing that fuel. And so we're cutting up fruits for our kids and things like that. Cut up fruits for yourself.
Welcome to Functional Medicine Coaching Moms podcast, where simplifying healthy lifestyle change for moms is the only goal. Hello, today we are happy to have Kristina, otherwise known as the Wellness Architect, on the show. Kristina is a functional medicine certified health coach and married mother of 2 girls, and she's here today to talk about functional parenting. This episode is for you if you're tired of being fueled on all the wrong things, like coffee, adrenaline, and inconsistent meals. Kristina specializes in helping women in gentle ways to live their most vibrant life.
Kristina was working in New York City as an architect for one of the largest public transportation systems in the world. However, she began to experience burnout from high stress and was diagnosed with infertility and thyroid issues. She was pushing through and ignoring how her body felt every time she boarded the train to head into the office. It wasn't until she recognized the connection between mind and body and its impact on health that she began to heal.
Kristina holds a master's in environmental management and spent over 10 years working in New York City as an architect. She feels grateful to say that her focus is still on foundations for health. And at the end of the podcast, Kristina has a special offer for our listeners today.
So, Kristina, first of all, thank you so much for joining us. And we would love for you to tell us more about what functional parenting is. I'm sure many have never heard of this. And so we're really curious to hear about what functional parenting is all about.
Thank you so much, Kristen and Raquel, for having me on. The idea that functional parenting. So I know when my oldest was born, we tried to implement a lot of what they call gentle parenting, right? So it's the idea, it relies a lot on empathy. It relies a lot on understanding, respect. You want to take that shame and that blame out of the parenting. And so it wasn't until my youngest was born and I was like, okay, so we're implementing all this gentle parenting. And I'm like, all right, it's an idea about meeting your child where they're at. But the idea that, well, how do we reflect that upon ourselves as mothers, as parents, right? And how do we show ourselves the utmost care of respect and kindness? Because, ultimately, there's certain important qualities that you want to cultivate with your children. And, you know, just to name a few, like, you want them to be kind, you want them to prioritize rest and all these things. And so it was really about that reflection moment, and that's sort of the way that I've always defined it. And it took me some time to navigate to that spot.
Awesome. As you're speaking, yeah, absolutely. I think the first thing that moms do when we start having kids is we put ourselves on the back burner, and we don't even realize that we're doing is you just said you're really prioritizing all these things for your kids. But are you also role modeling that by doing it for yourself?
Right.
So, what are some ways, like some examples, maybe, like for that mom that's, struggling in this arena?
Sure. So there's so many different approaches, and I think that for each mom it's so different, but I think it doesn't have to be overwhelming. And I've
Mm.
always loved the quote that less is more, because oftentimes as moms we are already carrying so much. Like our mental loads are just constantly going. Our brains are unable to shut off even, you know, at bedtime, it's hard. So I think it's important to look at, certain lifestyle changes and where do you want to start first? Is it nourishment? is it really getting everything under control as far as like how I'm handling my day-to-day stress and things like that. And I love to, I mean, personally, my mantra has always been that, and I know a lot of others would agree, food is medicine, right? So I love to start with that nourishment portion, because oftentimes, and I found this during sort of the postpartum period with my oldest, that if you're unable to fill your cup, it's very hard to pour, right? So you
Right.
can't run on empty. And so the biggest thing that I always, even moms and family and friends that have just had children, new moms, even moms with kids in their teens, make sure you carve out time to make sure that you're providing that fuel. And so we're cutting up fruits for our kids and things like that. Cut up fruits for yourself, and it's funny when I tell people that, like, they laugh, and I'm like, no, really, like, you're cutting up some apples with peanut butter, almond butter, whatever it is, cut it up for yourself and put some to the side. And when you're at on the go or at the park, whatever, make sure you're fueling yourself, because it's hard to operate on empty.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a common thing for moms. Like, just they prepare their kids lunch or something, and then they just forget about themselves and continue on through the day. And then by 4 o'clock or something, you're really depleted. So
Yeah.
I think that's such a helpful tip. Just to remember, it is important. You do need to nourish yourself. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to be resilient to handle all the stress that's coming your way.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And Kristen, you brought up a great point, because, it's often that 3 or 4 o'clock, that sweet spot of the day where a lot of us, and I'll admit, I kind of result to my cup of coffee or my cup of matcha, right? But that's not the backbone of the fuel. Like, we need, you want to nourish yourself with, whole foods, and you want to make sure that you're doing for yourself what you want your kids to do. And that's all about that reflection. And it's like, you know, you want them to prioritize health and wellness, right? You want them to prioritize eating well. Well, how is mom doing that? And it's so important to constantly reflect and say, am I modeling the same behavior that I want my kids to incorporate? And that's how I've looked at it.
Yeah, absolutely. I think also I could hear moms saying, "I don't have time. I'm doing I got to do this. I got to do that. I don't have time." And I think it's such a great point that I actually was going I was at this store, and the woman behind the register was really like disheveled by the gentleman that was like she was taking his order. And I just looked at her, and she looked at me really quick, and I just said to her, I was like, breathe. And she's like, I know, I wish I could, but I can't. And I said, no, this is your life, girlfriend. This is your life. And this is like at a store. It's so weird. But when he left and it was my time to order, she literally looked at me and said, thank you.
Oh,
Like,
I love that.
Wow.
to give
Yeah.
ourselves permission to just be like, hey, I matter. Like, I'm so important. Like, we I think sometimes view ourselves, I think moms, as we're serving. We're serving our
Yes.
family, we're serving our kids, we're serving our husbands, or our parents, our aging parents. And it's really important for us to start thinking about, because it's just like out of sight, out of mind. For some reason, we don't have ourselves in sight. And I think it's so great, that point that you're making about just stepping back and being that role model, because where are you serving from? Is it from this place?
Yeah.
Oh my God, I got to do this. Or is it like, okay, I'm going to do this. How are you showing up for these people?
That's so important, Raquel. And you brought up such a great point as you were speaking. I couldn't help but think of like this sort of like this tree, right? Mothering is not just, we're not just mothering our children, right? There's so many different aspects of mothering, and you're put in that role, and you are the key source of nurture, right? And I've always, there's that saying, it's like, who's going to nourish the mother, right? And so oftentimes it's not anyone, and sometimes like, you're right, we're taking care of, whether it be our like elderly parents or in-laws or whoever it be. And so it's so important to have that incorporated in, and like you said, give yourself permission to do so.
That's really, really, really important. Um, I noticed, like in your story, you were an you had that. It sounds like a very intense, demanding job of architect, and I just find it really interesting how you kind of connected your that work that you did as an architect to the architect of wellness and how
Yeah.
that connects.
Yeah, I love that. I love synonyms and I love making analogies and things like that. So when I look at health and wellness, and anytime I explain to someone what a health coach does, right? Um, I love to be able to speak to the fact that essentially, coaches are helping you design and map out your blueprint. And so I've always kind of built that in because, you know, and also as you had mentioned, like, building the foundations for health, but really that's what it is. You're sitting down with your clients and, yes, we're not designing walls and foundations, but essentially we are
Yes.
because the foundation of your health relies with how you want to build it, and a coach is there to support you to do that, to make sure that that structure stands and that structure is sitting on good soil, right? And it's sitting on a good foundation, and there's so many components that go into it. And I just love being able to provide that analogy because a lot of people feel like they don't have that control, or they, well, where do I start? And again, that design process, that's where the magic happens. And
Yeah.
I think a lot would agree that that's sort of the beauty in coaching.
Yeah,
Yeah, and like as
absolutely.
moms, we're so scattered. We're all over the place. So we might start to make a change, but we're not really consistent about it or we don't know where to start. So I think that that foundation that you're talking about just seems so helpful for moms that are really confused. So you talked a little bit about nourishment. What are other areas of functional parenting that you could share with us?
Sure. So there's another component of it where I like to think of it as um, providing that self-compassion for yourself. So you have the component of, nourishment in foods, but also it gets to that sort of, that mind-body connection. And oftentimes when you tell a mother of, however many kids they have, whatever the age is, you tell a mother like, oh yeah, well, gratitude journal, or that a lot of time the days just don't, there's not enough hours in a day, right? So um, that mind-body connection and basically allowing yourself, giving yourself permission to check in and take that inventory. And I can't remember if I mentioned it earlier, but again, using the moments, those day-to-day moments, whether it be, the seventh or eighth time you washed a certain pan or pot, right? You're washing dishes, you're folding laundry, using those moments to kind of build in and ask yourself, well, how did I show up today and show myself kindness? And, what have I done today, or even this week? What did I do today to show myself respect without any type of shame or blame? Because that's the essence. Like that's, we want to be able to reflect that on ourselves. And I think giving yourself that moment to do so, whether it be in the mix of sometimes pure chaos, right? It's the mix of,
Hmm.
you're getting dinner ready, lunches, the to-do list sometimes are on, they could get pretty long. But I think it's so important to allow yourself, even if it's 16 seconds, and that's what I always preach. It could be something so small, but just asking yourself those things. And it's amazing when you start to build that in against those day-to-day routines, and you're like, oh wow, like what did I do for myself today? Or what did I really want to do that I didn't get around to? And what is my body calling for? You know, I found that when my youngest was born, I allowed time for myself, to heal and recover. But at the same time, uh, once I felt that I could, the movement portion was how I fed my soul. Like I needed to be able to move, and it wasn't just so much, going for a walk, with the baby in the stroller. Like I wanted to move, I wanted to sweat, and I think that looks different for every mom, every woman, but it's so important to have that built in.
Yeah, I really like the idea of checking in with yourself because I think, to your point, you're just kind of jumping from task to task. And
Yeah.
I mean, what would you say to the mom that thinks about it and is like, I've done nothing for myself in like a long time?
Yeah, I with those, and sometimes you hear those more than not, because it's easy to lose track of the days become weeks and they turn to months, right? What I typically say to mothers that say, well, I haven't been able to answer what that is. I would ask, what would fuel you right now? What would bring you the utmost joy? And sometimes when you ask women that, mothers, they need a couple of seconds to
Yeah.
respond. They're like, wait, what?
Mm,
Right?
mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Like, why? Because you're not even in that headspace,
Yeah. Yeah.
No,
and
and
it's
no one
so
asks you that. No one's going to ask you that
no,
question.
I
no,
love the
no,
idea of brainstorming like that. That's, just like let it rip, and, it takes a minute. It could take a
yeah,
real minute because you're not used to it. You're so disconnected possibly as well with yourself because you're so like running around like being a chicken without a head.
yes,
Hmm.
So getting that head back on and connecting is that, just even when you were saying like about the foundation and building that foundation, that to me is like a foundation, like what matters to you, what
yes,
fuels you, and just you as the architect. Wellness, it's like you have that foundation and you're building the house, and this is the house. We're the house that
yes.
Hmm.
we need to live in.
Exactly.
Absolutely. Absolutely, Raquel. You've said so much, and I almost want to, it really is, it becomes a mantra, because uh the mother is the home, right?
Mm,
And you're
mm,
building, and that's essentially what it is. And by
yes.
creating that space and allowing that structure to stand on its own requires some work, and
Yeah.
it could be just small, simple steps, but you're absolutely right. And I love that. I love
Yeah.
that analogy.
That sounds refreshing what you just said. And I don't think I've ever really quite heard that, the mother is the home.
Yeah, no, I
And
haven't either. Yeah, I like
yeah,
that.
but I really love that the mother is the home. Now I understand why my son's always barging into my bedroom. Everybody wants to hang out in my room.
Yep, absolutely.
It's like the comforting, right? It's like comforting. It's a safe space. So I think there's such a wonderful connection there when, a mom, you know, the woman behind the mom takes the time to understand what matters to her so that she can also, she's giving, in turn is still giving to her family. She's that energy.
Yes,
Hmm.
absolutely. Absolutely. And it's so important that energy, that it comes without attachment of shame or blame, because I think oftentimes we find ourselves in that vicious cycle, right? And
Yes.
I think we all do it, and we can't help it, but it gets into a vicious cycle. So it's also about breaking that up, you know?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. And that's a whole other thing, the shame and blame of, comparing and
Yes.
and also comparing parenting styles or feeling like,
Yep.
less than, or am I doing that right? And, understanding what might work for that family, but this is your family, and how to communicate with your own kids, and giving space and room for that. Yeah, we definitely have to probably have you back on to go into some
Yeah.
deeper conversations about this.
Yeah, just to be mindful of our time today. We're getting towards the end, and I just wanted you to give the opportunity just to tell us like what are two small things we could start with like today if we want to become more in along the lines of a functional parenting style.
Sure. So I think and again, like I like, less is more. And I think two easy, quick steps that you could do is,
Yes.
start with the nourishment portion. When you're preparing food for your family, for your child, s- prepare something for yourself. Nourish
Yes.
yourself, even if it's even if you're cutting up half of apple, whatever it is, have some for yourself. Prioritize yourself in that component. Pack it with you when you go with when you go with your kids, when you're bringing all the stuff that you normally would for others. The second item would be when you're doing those routine items. You're folding laundry. You're washing dishes. Take that moment. Invite yourself to take that moment and ask yourself, how did you show yourself kindness in that day? And I think it's so beautiful because at the end of the week, you could reflect back to, it's kind of your gauge. Well, how did I show up for myself today? And how I'm able to reflect the kind of qualities that I want my child to incorporate onto myself. And I think that's, again, using those day-to-day routines and tasks to incorporate that in. And that can only just be your starting point. And it's just a great way to take inventory of, like, how you feel and what you're doing for yourself. So
Those are
Yeah,
great foundational tools. Thank you so much for that, Kristina.
they really are. That
thank
would be
you.
very easy. Yeah, to
Yeah,
incorporate.
simple.
Not a lot.
Yeah,
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 that's
simple.
amazing. As I mentioned earlier, Kristina is offering our podcast listeners a complimentary 20-minute coaching session. Use the code FMCM, that stands for Functional Medicine Coaching Moms, and you can DM this code to Kristina on Instagram at the.wellness.architect, or reach out to her through her website at www.thewellnessdesign.net. Thank you so much for that. That's great. Our mom listeners will really appreciate that, because I think most of us could use a little bit of help with building our foundations for health. So that would be wonderful.
Yeah, that would be that's a great space to provide them. So thank you so much for that offer, Kristina.
Thank you guys. Thanks for having me. I really appreciate it.
And it was great. Yeah, it was great. We'll see you guys next time. The information provided in this podcast is for informational purposes only and is not intended for the purpose of diagnosing, curing, treating, or preventing any disease. We are functional medicine certified health coaches and not licensed medical professionals. The opinions and advice of guests are their own and also not considered to be medical advice. Always consult with a healthcare professional when making any healthy lifestyle changes. We would love to hear from our mom community. Any wellness topics that are high on your list, please DM us at Functional Medicine Coaching Moms. We can also be reached via email at info@functionalmedicinecoachingmoms.com. You can find Functional Medicine Coaching Moms podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and YouTube. If you enjoyed this episode, please hit the subscribe button.